Hello everyone, we are on chapter 7 and we are on paragraph 20, so let's get started. Naive realism, with its fundamental principle of the reality of all perceived things, is contradicted by experience, which teaches us that the content of percepts is of a transitory nature. The tulip I see is real today. In a year it will have vanished into nothingness. What persists is the species tulip. For the naive realist, however, this species is only an idea, not a reality. Thus, this theory of the world finds itself in the position of seeing its realities arise and perish, while what it regards as unreal, in contrast with the real, persists. Hence, naive realism is compelled to acknowledge, in addition to percepts, the existence of something ideal. It must admit entities which cannot be perceived by the senses. In doing so, it justifies itself by conceiving their existence as being analogous to that of sense-perceptible objects. Just such hypothetical realities are the invisible forces by means of which the sense-perceptible objects act on one another. Another such thing is hereditary, which works on beyond the individual, and is the reason why a new being which develops from the individual is similar to it, thereby serving to maintain the species. Such a thing, again, is the life principle permeating the organic body, the soul for which the naive mind always finds a concept formed in analogy with sense realities, and finally the naive man's divine being. This divine being is thought of as acting in a manner exactly corresponding to the way in which man himself is seen to act, that is, anthropomorphically. So we have paragraph 20 summarized as follows. Naive realism is contradicted by experience, which teaches us that the content of percepts is of a transitory nature, that is, the tulip I see today will be gone by winter, but what persists is the idea, the species of tulips. So, in this paragraph, Steiner points out how naive realism doesn't acknowledge the world of ideas, and it is something that is legitimate because experience tells us that what we perceive is a transitory nature, and he uses the example of a tulip. The tulip will die eventually, and what persists is the idea and the concept of the tulip, what we get from, when a tulip starts as a seed and it grows. So we have all these things that are associated with it, but as a tulip grows, it's a seed, and then it grows into a plant, and then it perishes. I mean, the idea of the tulip persists, and even when it's this small, we still see it as a tulip, and then when it perishes, it's like that's a dead tulip and whatnot. So it's the concept of the species that persists. And that's what he's pointing out in this part, and because naive realism doesn't believe in ideals, it has to sort of come to a point where it does have to admit it, because what persists is, again, the idea. So that's what Steiner is talking about in this paragraph. So also in this paragraph, he talks about how naive realism also uses sense-perceptible terms to describe things that are not perceptible. So instead of acknowledging directly that ideas exist, they'll come up with other ways to explain things, and they will not acknowledge that, but will describe it in other terms, and they describe it in terms similar to sense perception, sense-perceptible terms, and they use that in fields such as hereditary, and also in their concept of God. and we can see that as a lot of concepts are of God. People describe it in a very anthropomorphic way, which just means they're describing God in terms that we can understand, rather than, you know, acknowledging the world of ideas. So that they're by not acknowledging this world of ideals, it forces them to create these hypothetical realities. And so Steiner is going to continue to discuss this, but that's what he's saying in the latter half of this paragraph. So the first half, he talks about how percepts tend to have a transitory nature, and the other half is how they use sense perceptible terms to describe these things. He goes on in the next paragraph, so I'm going to move on to paragraph 21. Modern physics traces back, I'll start over again. Paragraph 21. Modern physics traces sensations back to processes of the smallest particles of bodies and of an infinitely fine substance called ether, or to other such things. For example, what we experience as warmth is within the space occupied by the warmth-giving body, the movement of its parts. Here again, something imperceptible is conceived in analogy with what is perceptible. In this sense, the perceptual analog to the concept body would be, shall we say, the interior of a totally enclosed space in which elastic spheres are moving in all directions, impinging one on another, bouncing on and off the walls, and so on. So 21 we summarized as follows. Modern physics traces back sensations to processes of the smallest particles of bodies and of an infinitely fine substance, example, ether or other such things. Naive realism will explain the imperceptible by comparing it to something that is perceptible, example, warmth to something that is perceptible. And so, okay, in this paragraph, Steiner's, has a little bit outdated view of physics. It's not really quite applicable because nowadays in physics we don't use terms like ether, but it does, the concept still applies, in that they use sense perceptible terms to explain something, and he uses the example of warmth. There is a footnote for the end of paragraph 21, so I'll just read that. He writes, that is, movements of a kind similar to those which can be perceived are supposed to occur imperceptibly within the body, and to account for the warmth which is perceived directly, but as something quite different. He'll go on discussing more of this concept, so I don't want us to get too stuck on what he's saying here, but his main point is just, again, is that naive realists are using to describe things that aren't perceptible in sense perceptible terms. So that's all for today, and we're going to move on to 22 next time. So if you have any questions, again, send me a message. Look forward to seeing you all again next time. Bye.